You are alone, not the modern kind of alone, not the pleasant Sunday afternoon kind, where you make a cup of tea and put on something you've been meaning to watch and feel vaguely virtuous about your own company. This is a different kind of alone. The year is approximately 1180. You are a woman in a small English market town, and your husband died 3 weeks ago of a fever that started in his chest and ended with a speed that left no time for preparation everywhere else. He has been buried. The priest has been paid. The neighbors have brought food and condolences, and a series of meaningful looks that you have been cataloging with the grim efficiency of someone who knows that meaningful looks have consequences. Your children, 2 of them, 7 and 9, are asleep in the next room. The workshop your husband ran is silent. The tools still arranged exactly as he left them because you haven't been able to bring yourself to move them, but also because you haven't yet decided what to do with them. And now you need to decide. The world around you, the medieval world, with all its rigid hierarchies and church authority and deeply held opinions about what women should and shouldn't do, has a very clear idea about what the next chapter of your story should look like. You should remarry. Quickly, ideally, before the legal complications of widowhood become too tangled, before the workshop falls idle, before the neighbors' meaningful looks harden into something more pointed. There is almost certainly a man who has already been identified by someone as a suitable candidate. There's almost certainly a conversation that is going to happen soon, whether you want it to or not. But here's the thing. You're not sure you want to remarry. You're not sure at all. And this uncertainty, this moment of a medieval woman standing at the edge of the prescribed path and wondering whether she might actually walk somewhere else, is what this video is about. Because the history of medieval women who lived without men is not a history of exceptions and anomalies, of unusual women who somehow escaped the rules of their time. It is a history of a substantial, varied, surprisingly well-documented population of women who navigated the medieval world on their own terms, who worked, owned property, ran businesses, made legal decisions, raised children, pursued spiritual vocations, built communities, created art, practiced medicine, and occasionally rewrote the rules of their societies in ways that the official historical record has consistently underestimated. These women were everywhere, in the widow's cottage and the merchant's counting house and the abbess's study and the anchorite's cell and the guild workshop and the royal court. They were peasants and noble women, merchants and mystics, healers and artists, administrators and rebels. They were, in short, human beings who had found themselves through widowhood, through vocation, through choice, through circumstance, living a life that the medieval world had not quite designed for them. And they were making it work. This is their story. Chapter 1. The legal landscape, what the law said, and what women did. Anyway, before we meet the women themselves, we need to spend a few minutes with the legal framework they were navigating, because understanding what the medieval law actually said about women, as opposed to what we assume it said, is the first and most important step in understanding why so many women were able to live more independently than the standard narrative suggests. The standard narrative goes something like this. Medieval women had no legal rights. They were the property of their fathers until they were the property of their husbands. They could not own land, could not enter contracts, could not appear in court, could not conduct business in their own name. They were legally invisible, permanently, subordinate, their entire existence defined by their relationship to the nearest available man. This narrative is not entirely wrong, but it is significantly incomplete, and the parts it leaves out are precisely the parts that allowed the women in this video to live the lives they lived, Let's start with the legal concept that is most important for our story: femme sole. In medieval English law, and with variations across French, German, and other European legal traditions, a woman existed in one of two fundamental legal categories. A femme covert was a married woman whose legal identity was, in the common law tradition, merged with her husband's. She could not own property independently, could not sue or be sued in her own name, could not enter contracts without her husband's involvement. Her legal existence was, in the technical sense, covered, that is the meaning of covert, by her husband's. A femme sole was a woman on her own. A widow, an unmarried woman of sufficient age and independence. In some urban contexts, a married woman who had been specifically designated femme sole for business purposes, a status that allowed her to conduct trade independently of her husband, to enter contract in her own name, to sue and be sued as an independent legal person. And here is the crucial point that the standard narrative misses. A femme sole had legal standing. A femme sole could own property. She could enter contracts. She could appear in court. She could conduct business. She could, within the considerable constraints of medieval society, act as an independent economic and legal agent. Widows, in particular, occupied a legal position that was often substantially more powerful than the position they had held as wives. Under English common law, a widow was entitled to dower, a share of her husband's estate, typically 1/3 of his lands, held for her lifetime use. Under Norman and French legal traditions, similar provisions existed. The specifics varied enormously by region, by local custom, by the specific terms of the marriage agreement, and by the social class of the people involved. But the principle was consistent. Widowhood, while personally devastating, came with legal rights that marriage had not. This legal reality explains something that modern readers often find surprising. The medieval period was full of widows who were economically powerful, legally active, and politically significant, not despite their lack of husbands, but in a meaningful sense because of it. The removal of the husband, the legal figure whose existence had coverted theirs, freed them into a legal independence that was not available to married women. The urban legal traditions of medieval Europe were, in some respects, even more accommodating of female independence than the rural common law. The guild cities of Northern Europe, particularly in the Low Countries, in the German Rhineland, and in England, developed specific legal provisions for women in trade. In London, the custom of femme sole, trader, allowed a married woman to register as an independent trader, taking on the full legal responsibilities and rights of an independent business person, specifically so that her trading activities did not expose her husband to liability for her commercial decisions. This was not a feminist provision. It was a commercial one. The guild cities needed the economic participation of women, particularly in textile production, retail trade, and the food and drink industries, and they were willing to create legal frameworks that accommodated this participation. The result was a system in which women, both widows and, in the femme sole trader context, married women acting independently, could own shops, employ workers, belong to guilds, and participate in the urban economy in ways that the standard narrative of medieval female legal disability entirely obscures. The church courts, the ecclesiastical legal system that ran parallel to secular courts and handled matters of marriage, morality, wills, and spiritual offenses, were, in some respects, more equitable than secular courts in their treatment of women. Women could testify in church courts. they could bring cases. The church's interest in regulating marriage and sexual behavior meant that it had a direct institutional investment in the legal standing of women as parties to marriage contracts, which created a space in which women's testimony and women's interests had to be taken seriously. The practical reality of medieval women's legal lives was therefore considerably more varied and more active than the simple "women had no rights" narrative allows. This doesn't mean the system was fair. It was not. The constraints were real. The discrimination was real. The violence that backed up male authority was real. But within and alongside those constraints, women were constantly finding, creating, and exploiting legal spaces that gave them room to act, and many of them used that room with impressive effectiveness. Chapter 2: The Widow's World: Power, Property, and the Art of Not Remarrying. Let's go back to the woman we left at the beginning of this video. Standing in her dead husband's workshop, children asleep in the next room, meaningful looks from neighbors already accumulating. She has a choice to make, and the choice is not, as the conventional narrative would have it, simply between remarrying and destitution. The choice is considerably more interesting than that. If she chooses not to remarry, and many medieval widows did choose exactly this, what does her life actually look like? The answer depends enormously on her social class, her geographic location, the specific legal traditions of her region, and the nature of the property her husband left. But across these variables, certain patterns are consistent enough to describe. First, she has her dower. If she is in England under common law, she has a right to 1/3 of her husband's real property for the rest of her life. This is not dependent on her behavior, not contingent on her remaining a widow, not revocable by her husband's family. It is hers, legally guaranteed, a financial foundation on which she can build. Second, she may have her husband's business. In urban contexts particularly, the widow of a craftsman or merchant often inherited not just the physical assets of the business, the tools, the stock, the premises, but the social and professional relationships that made it function. In many guild traditions, the widow of a guild member had the right to continue her husband's trade, employ his apprentices, and operate under the guild's protections. She stepped legally and practically into his professional shoes. This was not a purely benevolent provision. The guilds had practical reasons for it. If a master craftsman died midway through a complex commission, someone needed to complete it. If his apprentices were left without a master, their training was disrupted. The widow who continued the business solved these problems, and the guild's willingness to accommodate her was driven as much by commercial logic as by generosity. But the effect for the widow herself was significant. She had a business, she had income, she had a professional identity. She was not dependent on the goodwill of a new husband. The historical record is full of these women. The London silk women of the 14th and 15th centuries, a community of female traders in the luxury textile industry whose economic power was sufficient for them to petition Parliament on matters of trade policy, included many widows who had inherited their husbands' trade connections and expanded them into independent enterprises of considerable sophistication. The Brewsters of medieval English towns, women who brewed and sold ale, a trade so thoroughly associated with women that the word Brewster is grammatically feminine, included widows who ran substantial brewing operations serving their communities. Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester, sister of King Henry III of England, widow of the famous Simon de Montfort, managed the financial affairs of a major noble household for years during her husband's absences, and after his death with a competence that the historical record makes clear was entirely her own. The household accounts she maintained survive and have been studied by historians who have found in them evidence of sophisticated financial management and considerable independent judgment. But perhaps the most interesting cases are the wealthy widows of the high and late medieval period, whose control of substantial property made them players in the political landscape of their time. Because a widow with significant land holdings was not merely an economic actor, she was a political one. Her lands generated military obligations, knights who owed service to whoever held the land, and the question of who would control those lands and those obligations was a matter of direct concern to the king. This is why medieval kings were so interested in the remarriage of wealthy widows. The concern was not primarily moral or paternal. It was strategic. A widow who controlled significant lands was controlling resources that the king wanted to direct toward his own political allies. The king's right to arrange the remarriage of his tenants' widows, a feudal prerogative that persisted in English law well into the medieval period, was essentially a right of resource allocation. Widows who resisted this right were resisting royal authority, and doing so required both legal skill and personal courage. Nicolas de la Haye is one of the most extraordinary examples of a medieval widow operating as an independent political and military power. She inherited the hereditary shrievalty of Lincolnshire, the office of sheriff, from her father and held it through 2 husbands and then as a widow, when the forces of the rebel barons and their French allies besieged Lincoln Castle in 1217, one of the decisive engagements of the First Barons' War. Nicolas de la Haye was the castellan in command. She was in her 60s. She had been holding the castle against the siege for months. When the royal relief force arrived and its commander asked her to hand over the castle keys, she offered them to him, along with a request to be relieved of her office on account of her age. The commander, William Marshal, the most famous knight in England, declined to take them and told her to keep defending the castle. She did. The royalists won. Nicolas de la Haye's role in preserving English royal authority in the north is not incidental to the outcome of the battle. It is central to it. The strategies medieval widows used to protect their independence were varied and often impressively creative. Some paid the king directly. The feudal fine for the right not to be compelled to remarry was a recognized legal transaction, and wealthy widows paid it readily, essentially purchasing their own freedom. Some entered into protective relationships with powerful nobles or with the church that provided cover against compulsion. Some remarried strategically, choosing a much older husband or a man of lower social status who would give them more practical independence, or someone with whom a specific political alliance made the marriage worthwhile without threatening the widow's fundamental autonomy. Some simply refused and faced the consequences. Margaret Paston, of the famous Paston Letters, the extraordinary collection of family correspondence from 15th century Norfolk that gives us one of the most direct windows into the daily life of a medieval gentry family, was not a widow in the most dramatic sense, but her correspondence shows the kind of fierce, practical intelligence and determined management of family affairs that characterized the medieval woman who had decided to handle things herself. When her husband John Paston died in 1466, Margaret managed the family's complex legal affairs, extensive property disputes, and the social and financial positioning of her children with a tenacity and skill that the letters document in remarkable detail. She was not unique. She was representative of a class of medieval women, gentry wives and widows, whose management of family affairs was so integral to the functioning of medieval property-owning society that the system literally could not have worked without them. Chapter 3. The Anchoress, living walled into God. Now we move to a very different kind of female independence, one that achieved freedom through an act of radical renunciation, so extreme that modern audiences typically react to it with something between fascination and genuine alarm. The anchoress, an anchorite, from the Greek anakorein, to withdraw, was a person who had chosen to live in permanent solitary enclosure, walled into a small cell attached to a church, never to leave, spending the rest of their life in prayer, contemplation, and whatever intellectual or spiritual work the cell allowed. While male anchorites existed, the majority of medieval English anchorites were women, a statistical fact that has generated considerable scholarly discussion about what it meant for medieval women to find their highest freedom in the most extreme form of physical confinement. The ceremony of enclosure was, in its medieval form, functionally identical to a funeral. The anchoress was led to her cell in a procession. The priest read the office of the dead over her. She was symbolically buried. In some traditions, earth was scattered over her as she entered the cell. The cell door was sealed. From this point forward, she was dead to the world. Her legal existence, in secular terms, was over. Her property, if she had any, was distributed. Her social identity was dissolved. And in return for all of this, she received something that very few medieval women had access to in any other way: complete freedom from the demands of the social world. No husband, no household management, no children, no social obligations, no need to navigate the complex, exhausting politics of medieval female social life. The anchoress had nothing to do but think, pray, and write, and some of them, given that freedom, produced intellectual and spiritual work of extraordinary depth and power. Julian of Norwich is the most famous English anchoress, and she is famous for very good reason. Julian was enclosed in a cell at the Church of St. Julian in Norwich. She took the church's name, her birth name being unknown, probably in the 1390s, though the exact date is uncertain. Before her enclosure in May 1373, when she was approximately 30 years old and gravely ill, she experienced a series of 16 visions, showings, she called them, of Christ's passion, accompanied by theological insights of unusual depth and originality. She spent the next 20 years thinking about what she had experienced, refining her understanding, and eventually writing it down in the work known as Revelations of Divine Love. This work is the first book in the English language known to have been written by a woman. It is also, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most theologically sophisticated and spiritually profound works of the medieval period. Not merely for a woman, not merely for a lay person, but by the standards of medieval theology in general. Julian's engagement with the problem of suffering and divine love, her central question being how a God who is all love can permit suffering, and her central answer involving a theological complexity that theologians are still writing about today, is original, rigorous, and deeply humane. Her famous formulations, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," is often quoted in isolation as a kind of medieval reassurance, a comforting platitude. In context, it is anything but. It is Julian's response to the direct theological question of what happens to people who sin and suffer. Her insistence against the prevailing theological current of her time, that divine love is so fundamental to the nature of reality that even sin and suffering are, in some way, she is struggling to articulate, encompassed by it. This is not easy optimism. It is hard-won theological courage. Julian accomplished this work from a cell approximately the size of a large modern bathroom, with no formal theological training. She specifically and repeatedly describes herself as unlettered, though the sophistication of her Latin references and her engagement with contemporary theology suggests this was at least partially a strategic self-deprecation. She had a window to the outside through which she spoke with visitors seeking spiritual counsel, and people did seek her out. Marjorie Kempe, the remarkable mystic, whose own story we will get to shortly, visited Julian and records a conversation of considerable spiritual depth. The anchoress's cell was not quite the complete isolation that the enclosure ceremony suggested. She typically had at least one servant, a maid who managed the physical necessities of daily life, brought food, handled communication with the outside world. She had a window facing into the church, through which she could follow the services and receive communion. She had the window to the outside, through which the world came to her. This last point is important. The anchoress, sealed in her cell, cut off from the social world, was often, paradoxically, one of the most socially connected people in her community. People came to her for counsel, for prayer, for the specific kind of advice that someone outside the social world, someone with no stake in its politics, no agenda to serve, no position to protect, could offer. The anchoress was the medieval equivalent of a therapist who has absolutely no incentive to tell you what you want to hear, because she has nothing to gain from your approval. The Ancrène Vitae, the guide for anchoresses, written in the early 13th century, probably by an Augustinian canon for a group of 3 sisters who had chosen the anchoritic life, gives us an extraordinary window into what this life actually looked like in practice. The text is practical, specific, and in places surprisingly warm. It instructs the anchoresses on their prayer schedule, their reading, their fasting, their management of servants, their handling of visitors, their clothing, their care of animals. They were permitted to keep a cat because practical. It also instructs them on managing the inevitable complications of their social position, the way that people would come to gossip through, the window, the way that gifts and donations needed to be handled to avoid the appearance of commerce, the way that their visible austerity could become a form of pride that needed to be guarded against. The anchoress's life was not for everyone. It required a specific kind of temperament, a specific level of intellectual self-sufficiency, and a willingness to renounce things that most people, then and now, would find the renunciation of genuinely painful. But for the women who chose it and thrived in it, the anchorite cell offered something genuinely extraordinary. A space of their own, guaranteed by religious authority, protected by community piety, and large enough, however small it was physically, to contain a life of the mind. Chapter 4. The Beguines. Community without vows. You are walking through the streets of Bruges in approximately 1250. The city is prosperous, busy, loud with the sounds of textile production, the clattering of looms, the voices of merchants negotiating prices, the smell of dyes and wool, and the particular damp wool smell of cloth being processed. Bruges is at this moment one of the most economically dynamic cities in Europe, a center of international trade, whose cloth merchants have connections stretching from England to Italy. You turn a corner and enter a different world. Through a gate in a wall, you step into a cluster of small houses arranged around a courtyard with a garden and a chapel. The noise of the city falls away. Women move quietly between the houses, some in plain dark dresses, some in what appears to be a semi-religious habit, but is not quite the habit of any order you recognize. They are working, spinning, weaving, teaching children from the neighborhood, caring for a woman brought in from the street who appears to be ill. Some are reading, one is writing. This is a beguinage, and the women who live here are beguines. The beguine movement is one of the most fascinating and most underappreciated phenomena in medieval European history. It emerged in the Low Countries in the late 12th century and spread rapidly across Northern Europe, through France, Germany, and beyond during the 13th and 14th centuries. At its height, the beguine movement encompassed tens of thousands of women across hundreds of communities, living a form of religious life that was unlike anything the medieval church had officially sanctioned. The beguines were not nuns. They took no permanent vows. They could leave the beguinage and marry if they chose. They owned their own property. Some beguinages charged rent for the small houses within their walls, and the women who lived there owned their furniture and their personal possessions. They worked in textile production, in nursing, in teaching, in the care of the poor and sick. They ran their own communities, elected their own leaders, managed their own finances. What they were was a community of women who had chosen a religious life without surrendering their legal independence, without entering an institutional structure controlled by men, and without making the permanent, irrevocable commitment of conventional monastic vows. The church's reaction to this was, predictably, complicated. On one hand, the beguines were doing things the church approved of. They were living piously, practicing charity, caring for the sick, educating children. Their communities were centers of genuine religious devotion. The mystical theology that emerged from the beguine movement, particularly the extraordinary works of Mechthild of Magdeburg and Marguerite Porete, both of whom we will meet shortly, was among the most spiritually intense and intellectually serious religious writing of the medieval period. On the other hand, the beguines were doing something the church found fundamentally unsettling. They were living a religious life that was not under clerical control. There was no abbot or bishop overseeing their spiritual life. There was no rule governing their behavior in the way that the rule of Saint Benedict governed monastic communities. They read scripture in the vernacular, which the church was not always enthusiastic about lay people doing independently. They discussed theology among themselves, and some of them were producing theological writing of a sophistication that seemed, to some clerical observers, to exceed what women without formal training should be capable of. The beguine mystic Marguerite Porete wrote a treatise called The Mirror of Simple Souls, a sophisticated theological dialogue exploring the soul's journey toward union with God, that was condemned by the Bishop of Cambrai and publicly burned. Marguerite continued to circulate it. She was eventually brought before the Inquisition in Paris, refused to recant or to answer the inquisitors' questions, and was burned at the stake in 1310. The irony is exquisite and terrible. Her book, condemned and burned, survived in copies that circulated anonymously for centuries, read and venerated by people who had no idea its author had been executed as a heretic. It was not identified as Marguerite's work until the 20th century. Mechthild of Magdeburg's The Flowing Light of the Godhead, a visionary mystical text written in the vernacular German of the 13th century, using the language of courtly love poetry to describe the soul's relationship with the divine, was equally extraordinary and equally controversial. Mechthild was a beguine for much of her life, before entering a convent at Helfta in her old age, and her writing preserves the specific spiritual energy of the beguine movement. Intensely personal, emotionally direct, theologically ambitious, and written in the language of ordinary people rather than the Latin of the clerical establishment. The beguinage itself, as a physical and social institution, was a remarkable achievement of medieval female community organization. The Grand Beguinage of Bruges, which has survived largely intact and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, gives you a direct physical sense of what these communities look like. The small houses arranged around a courtyard, each one a private domestic space within a larger communal setting. The chapel at the center providing the shared spiritual life, the garden providing both food and contemplative space. This is a thoughtful, practical human-scale design for communal living that reflects generations of female organizational intelligence. The beguines manage their communities with an administrative sophistication that rivals any medieval institution. The Grand Mistress, the elected leader of a large beguinage, oversaw finances, arbitrated disputes, managed relations with city authorities and church officials, and maintained the community's reputation with the surrounding urban society on whose support the beguinage depended. The financial records of some beguinages that have survived show careful, systematic accounting. Income from rents, from the sale of textile products, from donations, expenditure on food, building maintenance, charity to the poor. These are the records of functioning, self-sustaining institutions run by women who knew what they were doing. The beguine movement declined in the later medieval period under sustained pressure from the church hierarchy, which periodically condemned it, attempted to fold beguine communities into established religious orders, and prosecuted individual beguines for heresy when their theological independence became too visible. But it never entirely disappeared, and the beguinages that survived in Belgium and the Netherlands continued to function, in some cases well into the modern period, with the last beguine dying in 2013. 3,000 years after the first beguinages were founded, the last beguine died in her small house in a Flemish town. That is, by any measure, a remarkable institutional survival story. Chapter 5. The Merchant Women, Trade, Guilds, and Economic Independence. You are in a fabric shop in 14th century London. The shop is on Cheapside, the great commercial street of medieval London, loud and crowded and smelling of 100 different things simultaneously. None of them particularly pleasant, but all of them alive. The shop itself is neat, purposeful. The bolts of cloth arranged with the careful logic of someone who knows exactly what they have and exactly what it is worth. Behind the counter, a woman in her mid-40s is conducting a negotiation with a merchant who has come from Antwerp specifically to buy silk thread. And she is winning the negotiation with a composure that suggests she has been winning negotiations for a considerable number of years. Her name, let's say, is Alice. She is a silk woman. She learned the trade from her mother, who learned it from her mother, in a tradition of female craft knowledge that runs back several generations in this city. She employs 3 women and 2 apprentice girls. She belongs to an informal guild of London silk women, not formally chartered in the way that the male-dominated guilds are chartered, but functioning, networked, collectively powerful enough to have petitioned Parliament twice about trade regulations that were damaging their business. She is a widow. She has no intention of remarrying. Alice is not a fictional character in the sense of being invented. She is a composite, a figure assembled from the documented reality of the London silk women, who appear in the historical record with remarkable frequency and detail throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The silk women of London were real. They were numerous, they were economically significant, and their story is one of the most compelling examples of female economic independence in medieval European history. The silk industry in medieval London was, to an extraordinary degree, a female industry. The production of silk thread and silk fabric, a luxury trade, serving the wealthy households of the English nobility and the church, was dominated by women at the skilled production level. Women twisted and braided and wove silk with a technical expertise that was recognized by the market. Recognized in the sense that people who wanted fine silk work sought out female producers specifically, because the female craftswomen in this trade were simply better at it than their male competitors. This female dominance of a high-value craft had significant economic consequences. The silkwomen of London were not marginal figures in the textile economy. They were central players in a trade that connected England to the continental silk markets of Italy and the Low Countries, that supplied the luxury clothing needs of the English court, and that generated substantial commercial revenues. And because they were economically significant, they had leverage that they used with impressive skill. The 1455 petition of the London silkwomen to Parliament is one of the most remarkable documents in medieval English economic history. The silkwomen petitioned against the importation of foreign-made silk thread that was undercutting their domestic production, arguing that the trade supported hundreds of women and children who would be reduced to poverty if the imports continued unchecked. The petition was successful. Parliament enacted restrictions on silk thread imports in response. This is a group of women with no formal legal standing as a chartered guild, successfully lobbying the English Parliament to change trade law in their favor. The mechanisms by which the silkwomen achieved this are instructive. They worked through the social networks of their wealthy clients, the aristocratic and wealthy merchant women who bought their products, and who had the social access to carry their petition forward. They framed their argument in terms that Parliament would find sympathetic the welfare of poor women and children, rather than in terms of their own commercial interests, which would have been easier to dismiss. They were politically sophisticated in the way that people who have been navigating institutions not designed for them tend to become, acutely aware of how to frame an argument, who to approach, what language to use. The broader picture of female economic activity in medieval European cities is similarly rich and similarly underappreciated. In Paris, the guild regulations known as the Livre des Métiers, compiled by Etienne Boileau in the 1260s, list approximately 100 craft guilds, 6 of which were exclusively female, and many others of which admitted women alongside men. The exclusively female guilds included silk spinners, silk ribbon makers, and other textile crafts. Again, the pattern of female dominance in luxury textile production, repeating across national boundaries. In the German cities of the Rhine Valley, Cologne, Frankfurt, Strasbourg, women's participation in guild-regulated crafts was similarly widespread, documented in guild records that show women as both masters and apprentices in a range of trades. The Hausgenossen of Cologne, a merchant guild, admitted women to full membership. Female brewers, bakers, and food traders were ubiquitous in medieval German urban life, their economic activity so normal and so integrated into the functioning of the urban economy that its absence from the standard historical narrative says more about the priorities of subsequent historians than about the medieval reality. The women who participated most successfully in medieval urban economies shared certain characteristics. They were typically urban, educated enough to maintain accounts and conduct correspondence, socially connected in ways that gave them access to markets and to the social capital that commercial activity required. They were often widows. The death of a husband who was himself a trader frequently gave a woman both the practical knowledge of the trade and the legal independence to continue it. And they were, characteristically, persistent. navigating guild restrictions, legal ambiguities, and social disapproval with the patient tenacity of people who had no option of simply giving up. The brewing trade deserves particular extended attention because it illustrates the arc of female economic participation with unusual clarity. In the early medieval period, brewing in England was almost entirely a female occupation. The brewster, the female brewer, was the standard producer of ale for her community. Ale production was organized around the household, using the same equipment and knowledge base as bread baking, and it was integrated into the domestic economy that women managed. The alewife, who sold ale from her home, was a figure so standard in medieval English life that she appears constantly in legal records, in literature, in visual art. The transition of brewing from a predominantly female to a predominantly male occupation, which occurred gradually across the 14th and 15th centuries as commercial brewing scaled up and guild organization brought it under male institutional control, is one of the clearest examples in medieval economic history of what happens when a female-dominated occupation becomes sufficiently profitable to attract male institutional interest. As brewing moved from the household scale to the commercial scale, as it required larger capital investment and generated larger profits, the guild system, dominated by men, designed to protect male economic interests, moved in and the women moved out. Judith Bennett, the historian whose work on medieval ale and brewsters has been foundational to our understanding of this transition, has called this process the patriarchal equilibrium, the tendency of social systems to find ways of maintaining female economic disadvantage, even as the specific forms of that disadvantage change. Medieval brewsters are a vivid illustration. They were economically active, economically important, and ultimately economically displaced, not by any change in their competence or their product, but by a shift in how the trade was organized and who organized it. But within the period when female brewing dominance persisted, and for individual women who maintained their position in the trade as the transition happened, the economic independence that brewing could provide was real and significant. The alewife who owned her own equipment, brewed regularly, and sold to her neighborhood, had income, had clients, had a social position in her community that did not depend on a husband. She was not wealthy. She was not powerful in any grand sense, but she was independent in the most fundamental sense. She could feed herself and her children from her own labor. That independence achieved in the face of consistent institutional resistance is the central story of medieval female economic life, not the grand exception of the wealthy merchant widow or the politically powerful noblewoman, though those stories matter too. But the steady, persistent, often invisible economic activity of ordinary women who found ways to make the system work for them, or who found ways to work around it when it wouldn't. Chapter 6, The Abbess, Power Through the Church. If you wanted to find the single institutional space in medieval Europe where a woman could exercise the most formal, recognized, and extensive authority, where she could govern a community, manage substantial economic resources, exercise quasi-episcopal religious functions, correspond as an equal with kings and popes, and be addressed with the deference normally reserved for the most powerful men in society, you would find it in a large medieval convent in the office of the abbess. The medieval abbess was, at the apex of the female monastic hierarchy, one of the most powerful people, not just women people, in her region. She governed her community with authority derived from the rule of Saint Benedict, which gave the abbot or abbess virtually unlimited authority over their community in matters of governance, discipline, and spiritual direction. She managed the estates that endowed her convent, which, in the case of major royal foundations, could be extensive and economically significant. She supervised the spiritual life, the education, the intellectual production, and the practical functioning of a community that might number in the hundreds. She did all of this without a man. The convent was a female institution, governed by a female hierarchy, producing its own administrative cadre of prioresses and cellaresses and sacristans and infirmarianses, female officers responsible for specific aspects of conventual life, trained within the institution, accountable to the abbess, and through her, too, the church hierarchy, the male presence that canon law required, a priest to say Mass, a confessor to hear the nuns' confessions, was a visitor, a functional necessity, not a governing authority. The abbesses of the great English convents, Shaftesbury, Barking, Wilton, Romsey, were baronesses in the secular as well as the ecclesiastical sense. They held their lands by feudal tenure from the king, which meant they owed the same obligations to the crown as any male baron. Knights' fees, hospitality, the attendance at royal councils that significant landholders were expected to provide. The Abbess of Shaftesbury held land sufficient to support approximately 100 knights, a military resource that made her a significant figure in the English feudal system, regardless of her sex or her religious vocation. The double monastery, an institution in which communities of monks and nuns lived adjacent to each other under the authority of a single head, was a feature of the early medieval period that gave some abbesses authority over men as well as women. Hilda of Whitby, the 7th century abbess who presided over the famous Synod of Whitby in 664, at which the English Church decided to follow Roman rather than Celtic practice in calculating Easter, a decision of enormous significance for the subsequent history of English Christianity, governed a double monastery, and was influential enough that kings and nobles sought her counsel. 5 of her male monks became bishops. Her authority was recognized not as exceptional or anomalous, but as the natural consequence of her position. The intellectual life of the female convents was one of the most significant and most underappreciated dimensions of medieval female independence. Convents were centers of female education in a society where formal education was otherwise almost entirely male-dominated. Girls sent to convents for their education, whether or not they intended to remain as nuns, learned to read and write Latin, to sing, to copy manuscripts, to engage with the texts of the Church Fathers, and the growing body of scholastic theology. The convent scriptorium, the writing room where manuscripts were produced and copied, was a space of female intellectual work whose products are scattered through the manuscript collections of European libraries. Hildegard of Bingen, whom we met in our previous video on medieval drugs, and whom we cannot avoid in any serious discussion of medieval female intellectual life, was an abbess, and her life illustrates the full range of what that position could mean in the right hands. She founded her own convent at Rupertsberg, establishing its physical buildings and its institutional character according to her own vision. She governed it with a combination of spiritual authority and practical competence. She composed music, the largest surviving body of composed music by any single individual before the 12th century, and wrote natural philosophy, theology, medicine, and visionary literature that she corresponded about with the most significant figures of her age, including Bernard of Clairvaux, Pope Eugene III, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Her letters to these powerful men are not deferential in the way that a woman of her time, writing to a pope or an emperor, might be expected to be deferential. They are direct, occasionally critical, sometimes explicitly corrective. She wrote to Frederick Barbarossa, reproving him for his treatment of the church. She wrote to church officials, condemning their corruption. She did this from a position of moral authority that the office of abbess and the specifically female charisma of the visionary gave her. A position that was not quite like anything else in medieval society, a space from which a woman could speak with a directness that would have been impossible in any other context. The specific female charisma of the visionary is worth pausing on, because it functioned as an important source of female authority in medieval society that operated somewhat outside the normal institutional channels. A woman who claimed to receive divine visions was claiming direct access to a source of authority higher than any human institution, higher than the church hierarchy, higher than the king, higher than the husband or the father. The church's response to this claim was always cautious and often hostile, because uncontrolled female prophecy was a direct threat to clerical authority. But the church also needed its mystics, needed the popular devotion that attached itself to genuine holy women, needed the legitimizing power that a recognized holy woman could confer on a bishop or a pope who sought her endorsement. The result was a complex negotiation between female visionary authority and male institutional authority that played out differently in different cases. Julian of Norwich, operating with considerable freedom in her cell. Marguerite Porete, burned for her theological audacity. Hildegard of Bingen, somehow managing to spend her entire life writing and saying things that would have gotten a less strategically managed figure into severe trouble. The female convent was not a paradise of gender equality. It was a hierarchical institution embedded in a larger hierarchical church, subject to male episcopal oversight, constrained by canon law, and capable of its own internal politics and abuses of power. The nuns who lived under a bad abbess had few recourses, and the convent, as an institution, could be a place of genuine suffering as well as genuine flourishing. But for the women who thrived in it, who found in the abbess's office a scope for authority and intellectual work unavailable anywhere else in their society, the medieval convent offered something genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. An institutional space where female excellence was not merely tolerated but required, where the governance of a complex human community was understood to be women's work, where the life of the mind had not just permission but obligation. Chapter 7. Marjorie Kempe, the woman who refused to be quiet. Let me introduce you to possibly the most exhausting person in medieval English history. Marjorie Kempe was born in Bishop's Lynn, now King's Lynn, in Norfolk in approximately 1373. She was the daughter of John Brunham, a prominent burgess who served as mayor of Lynn 5 times, which means she came from a prosperous, well-connected, solidly bourgeois family. She married John Kemp, a burgess of the town, and together they had 14 children. 14. After the birth of her first child, Marjorie experienced what we might now recognize as severe postpartum psychosis, a terrifying episode of mental illness involving visions of devils and a complete breakdown that lasted approximately 8 months before resolving. Following her recovery, she underwent a religious conversion experience that would, over the next several decades, make her one of the most remarkable and most controversial figures in medieval English spiritual life. What Marjorie Kempe did was this. She decided, in her late 20s and early 30s, that she wanted to live as a holy woman. Specifically, she wanted to live celibately, to withdraw from the sexual relationship with her husband, to go on pilgrimage, to receive the spiritual guidance of the best theological minds of her era, to live a life of intensive religious devotion, and to express that devotion in whatever way seemed appropriate to her, which frequently involved weeping loudly and dramatically in public places. The weeping is important. Marjorie Kempe wept. She wept at sermons, at Mass, at the sight of the Eucharist, at holy images, in the street, on ships, in churches across England and Europe and the Holy Land. She wept with a volume and a persistence that her contemporaries found, to put it mildly, challenging. She was thrown out of communities. She was accused of being drunk. She was accused of demonic possession. She was investigated for heresy multiple times in multiple cities, because in the atmosphere of the Lollard controversy, a layperson who was visibly and noisily religious outside of clerical control was automatically suspicious. She persisted through all of it. She negotiated unsuccessfully a vow of chastity with her husband. This was not a unilateral decision. A wife could not simply withdraw from the marital bed without her husband's consent, and obtaining that consent required negotiation, a specific agreement in which Marjorie promised to pay John's debts and to continue eating with him on Fridays rather than fasting as she wished. It was a business negotiation conducted between two people assessing their respective leverage, and Marjorie conducted it with the pragmatic intelligence she brought to most of the practical challenges of her life. She went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela, to Aachen, to Wilsnack. Medieval pilgrimage was not a comfortable undertaking. The roads were dangerous, the accommodations variable, the fellow pilgrims not always welcoming, and the physical demands considerable. Marjorie undertook these journeys as a woman, traveling without a husband, which meant she needed to find traveling companions willing to include her, manage her own finances, navigate foreign cities without a male protector, and deal with the constant low-level hostility that an independently traveling woman attracted. She did it anyway, repeatedly. The book of Marjorie Kempe, the account of her spiritual life that she dictated. She was apparently not literate herself, or not fully so, to scribes, first to a man who produced an unsatisfactory version, and then to a priest who produced the surviving text, is the first autobiography in the English language. It is also one of the strangest, most vivid, and most honest documents of medieval inner life that we have. Marjorie is not a likable narrator by conventional standards. She is vain. She is demanding. She is prone to interpreting every inconvenience as a spiritual test and every success as divine confirmation of her special status. She reports conversations with Christ, in which Christ tells her that she is particularly beloved to him, which she records without apparent irony. She describes her weeping in detail that suggests a complete lack of awareness of how it affects the people around her. But she is also honest in ways that medieval spiritual literature rarely is. She describes her fear, her doubt, her temptations, including a specific sexual temptation involving a man who was not her husband that she recounts with a directness that must have been startling to her original readers. She describes the genuine difficulty of the religious life she has chosen, the social cost of her unconventional behavior, the loneliness of being constantly controversial. She is a whole person, rendered in the first-person voice, in a way that medieval sources almost never render women. What Marjorie Kempe's life demonstrates most clearly is the specific kind of authority that the claim of divine communication gave to a medieval woman who was willing to insist on it against sustained social pressure. She had no formal education, no institutional position. no wealth sufficient to provide cover for her unconventional behavior. What she had was an absolute conviction that God was speaking directly to her, and a willingness to act on that conviction regardless of what anyone around her thought about it. She sought out the validation of recognized holy figures. Her visit to Julian of Norwich, already old and established in her anchorite's cell, was partly a request for confirmation that her experiences were genuine rather than diabolical. Julian apparently provided that confirmation, telling Marjorie that the tears of genuine religious feeling were a gift of the Holy Spirit, and that she should not be troubled by those who doubted her. She sought out and received the endorsement of bishops and priests, who, after interrogating her on points of theology, found her orthodox enough to support. She accumulated institutional endorsements, certificates of sorts, that she could produce when the next heresy accusation arose, with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood that the rules of her game required documentary evidence. And she persisted. Through the heresy accusations, through the companions who abandoned her, through the husband who needed care in his old age, she had, with remarkable irony, returned to nursing the man from whose marital bed she had negotiated her freedom, through the physical hardships of pilgrimage and the social hardships of being constantly, inescapably, publicly herself. The Book of Marjorie Kempe was lost for centuries. The only surviving copy was discovered in 1934 in the possession of the Butler-Bowden family, and its rediscovery was one of the most significant events in medieval English literary history. It gave us back a voice that had been silent for 500 years. Loud, difficult weeping, unstoppable. Chapter 8, The Healers, Medicine, Midwifery, and the Knowledge of Women. You're in a room that smells of herbs, not the decorative, diffuse kind of herb smell you might find in a modern kitchen. This is a working smell, dense and specific. Bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters. A fire with a clay pot simmering something that has been simmering since early morning. Shelves of stoppered bottles and cloth-wrapped bundles, arranged with a logic that is entirely legible to the woman who assembled it, and somewhat cryptic to everyone else. The woman in the room is perhaps 50. Her hands are stained from plant processing in a way that does not come out with washing. She is listening with focused attention to the woman who has come to see her, listening to a description of symptoms, of timing, of what has been tried already and what hasn't worked. She is not a physician. She has no degree from Salerno or Bologna or Oxford. What she has is several decades of empirical observation, a working knowledge of the medicinal plants available in this region, a network of other women whose knowledge supplements her own, and a reputation among the women of her community that has been built visit by visit, remedy by remedy, successful delivery by successful delivery. She is a healer. She is also, in the categories of her society, a woman operating at the edge of what is officially permitted, constantly at risk of crossing the line between recognized folk medicine and the prosecutable offense of practicing medicine without proper authorization, or worse, of crossing into the territory of magic and witchcraft that the church and secular authorities are watching with increasing attention. The history of women in medieval medicine is a story of two parallel traditions that existed in constant tension. The learned medical tradition, institutionally male, university-trained, operating through official channels, and the folk healing tradition, predominantly female, experientially trained, operating through social networks. Neither tradition was monolithic, neither was entirely without the other's influence, and the boundary between them was far more porous than either institution liked to admit. The learned medical tradition was, formally, closed to women. The medical schools of Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and Oxford did not admit female students. The medical guilds that regulated practice in major cities did not admit female members in most places and most periods. The official medical establishment of the medieval period was male in the same way that universities were male. By institutional design, backed by the authority of the church and the state. And yet, Trotula of Salerno, the legendary 11th century female physician of Salerno, is a figure whose historical existence has been debated for generations of scholars, but whose name, attached to 3 highly influential medical texts dealing with women's health, speaks to the existence, or at least the cultural belief in the existence, of female medical expertise in the very heart of the learned medical tradition. Whether the Trotula texts were written by a historical woman named Trotula, or whether they represent a compilation attributed to a female authority figure to give them credibility in their specific domain, women's medicine, they demonstrate that female medical knowledge was recognized as having a legitimate claim to authority in at least some medical areas. Women's health was the specific domain where the boundary between official and unofficial medicine was most permeable, and for the most obvious reason. Childbirth was attended by women. The midwife was not an alternative to the physician in the medieval birthing room. She was the standard practitioner. Male physicians were not present at normal deliveries, partly by convention and partly because there was genuine cultural resistance to male presence in the birthing room. The midwife was the expert, and her expertise was recognized as such, even by the official medical establishment. The midwife's knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and practice. A midwife trained her successors by bringing them to deliveries, by teaching them the manual techniques of managing difficult presentations, by passing on the accumulated empirical knowledge of what works and what doesn't in the specific emergency of childbirth. This knowledge was not written down in the same systematic way that university medical knowledge was written down, which means it is harder for historians to access. But its reality and its sophistication are attested in the outcomes it produced and in the consistent demand for experienced midwives that the historical record shows. The medicinal knowledge that complemented midwifery, the herbal preparations for pain relief in labor, for promoting uterine contractions when labor stalled, for treating postpartum hemorrhage, for managing the various complications of the months following delivery, was similarly empirically grounded and similarly transmitted through networks of female practitioners. As we discussed in the medieval drugs video, some of these preparations had genuine pharmacological basis. Others did not, but the practitioners who used them were not randomly guessing. They were drawing on generations of observation about what happened when specific preparations were used in specific situations. The Church's relationship with female healers was characteristically complex. The care of the sick was a corporal work of mercy, a positive Christian duty. And women who nursed the sick, who ran the infirmaries of convents, who attended deliveries and cared for the dying, were doing something the Church explicitly endorsed. The line between approved charitable healing and problematic magical healing was theoretically clear. Healing through prayer and approved natural remedies was licit. Healing through spells, charms, and supernatural invocations was not. But in practice, it was blurry in ways that created constant uncertainty for practitioners who might use both. The prosecution of female healers for witchcraft, which became more frequent in the later medieval period and accelerated dramatically in the early modern period, targeted a population that included genuine folk medical practitioners alongside women accused of causing harm. rather than healing it. The charge of maleficium, harmful magic, was the specific legal category that defined witchcraft in its most prosecutable form, and it was frequently attached to female healers when their patients died, rather than recovered. The healer who was praised when the patient survived was at risk of being prosecuted when the patient died, and the margin between the two outcomes in the state of medieval medicine was not always within anyone's control. Hildegard of Bingen, again, represents the extreme of what female medical knowledge could achieve when it operated within protected institutional space. Her medical works, Physica and Causae et Curae, represent a systematic attempt to organize and explain the natural world's medicinal properties within a theological framework that gave the project legitimacy. She was not practicing medicine in the street. She was writing theology that happened to be about medicine, which was an entirely different and entirely safer activity. The institutional protection of the convent gave her the space to produce work that a woman practicing medicine in an urban context could never have produced without risking prosecution. The ordinary female healer had no such protection. She practiced in the social space created by need. The need of the women who came to her in childbirth, in illness, in the management of the conditions that official medicine either couldn't or wouldn't address. And she operated with the constant awareness that her legitimacy was contingent on her success rate and the goodwill of her community. When that goodwill failed, the consequences could be severe. What the history of medieval female healers ultimately shows is something we have seen in every chapter of this story, that women's knowledge and women's expertise existed in medieval society in abundance, that it was genuinely useful and genuinely valued, and that it was simultaneously systematically excluded from the institutions that would have given it permanent recognition and protection. The midwife's knowledge saved lives. The alewife's knowledge fed communities. The abbess's knowledge governed institutions. The anchoress's knowledge shaped theology. None of this was acknowledged as it should have been. Some of it was actively suppressed. Most of it was simply ignored by the people who wrote the official record. We are, several centuries later, still finding it. Chapter 9. The Noble Woman. Castles, politics, and the management of everything. You are standing in the great hall of a castle in Normandy. The year is 1190. The lord of the castle, your husband, left 8 months ago with the army of the Third Crusade, heading east toward Jerusalem with a company of knights, a quantity of equipment that required 40-pack animals to transport, and an optimism about the duration of his absence that subsequent events have thoroughly failed to justify. He is, as far as you can determine from the occasional letter that has managed to find its way back across the distance between here and the Holy Land, alive. Beyond that, the situation is unclear. What is entirely clear is that someone needs to manage this castle. Someone needs to oversee the harvest, collect the rents, administer justice in the local court, manage the garrison, negotiate with the neighboring lord who has been making pointed inquiries about the western boundary of the estate, correspond with the king's administrators about the tax assessment, settle the dispute between the miller and 2 of the tenant farmers, and ensure that the winter provisions are adequate for both the household and the extended community that depends on the castle for protection and administration. That someone is you, and you know exactly what you are doing. The management of noble households in the absence of their male lords, during crusade, during war, during imprisonment, during any of the many circumstances that removed a medieval nobleman from his estates for extended periods, was one of the most consequential and most thoroughly documented forms of female authority in the medieval period, It was not exceptional. It was structurally expected. The medieval noble household needed to function whether or not its lord was present, and the person responsible for making it function in his absence was his wife. This responsibility was not informal or incidental. It was built into the training and education of noble women in ways that are clearly visible in the advice literature and household management texts of the medieval period. The Ménagier de Paris, a late 14th century French text written by an older bourgeois husband for his young wife, covers not just the domestic management of a wealthy household, but the agricultural management of rural estates, the supervision of servants and employees, the management of accounts, and the conduct of business on the husband's behalf. It assumes that the wife will need these skills and provides systematic instruction in them. Christine de Pizan, the Italian-born French poet and writer who became one of the most remarkable intellectual figures of the late medieval period, and whom we will meet properly shortly, wrote The Treasure of the City of Ladies in 1405, a guide for women of various social stations that includes extensive practical advice for noble women on managing their estates, their finances, their political relationships, and their households. Christine was not describing an ideal that she hoped women would aspire to. She was describing what women of her acquaintance actually did and providing systematic guidance for doing it better. The countesses and baronesses who managed English and French estates during the Crusades left documentary evidence of their competence that historians have been mining for generations. Household accounts, estate records, legal documents, correspondence. The paper trail of medieval female estate management is substantial, and it shows women conducting complex administrative operations with a level of skill and confidence that speaks to genuine training and genuine experience. The political dimension of noble female management extended well beyond household accounts. When a castle was threatened, when the neighbors who had been making pointed inquiries about the boundary escalated from inquiries to action, the châtelaine was expected to organize the defense. This is not a rare scenario in the historical record. It is a common one. Nicolas de la Haye, whom we met in the first section of this video, is only the most dramatic example of a pattern that appears across the medieval period in England and France. The wife or widow who holds a castle under siege while her husband is absent, who organizes the military and logistical resources available to her, who negotiates with the besieging force when negotiation serves better than resistance, and who makes the tactical decisions that determine whether the castle survives. Ermengarde of Narbonne, Viscountess of Narbonne, from 1143 to approximately 1192, ruling her viscountcy in her own right for nearly 50 years, is one of the most striking examples of a medieval noblewoman exercising genuine political and military authority without any male cover whatsoever. She inherited her title as a child, held it through a marriage that gave her husband no real authority over her domains, and ruled as an independent political actor throughout her long reign. She participated in military campaigns, conducted diplomatic negotiations with the King of Aragon and other major regional powers, presided over her own court, and patronized the troubadour culture that was one of the most important cultural developments of 12th century southern France. Her court at Narbonne was a center of literary and intellectual culture. The troubadour poets who performed there addressed her as a figure of genuine cultural authority, not merely as a patron whose money they needed, but as someone whose literary judgment mattered, whose approval was worth having for its own sake. The tonsons and partimans, the debate poems that were a major form in troubadour literature, record her as a participant in literary discussions about love and ethics in ways that suggest she was an active intellectual presence rather than a passive audience. The broader culture of the medieval court gave noblewomen specific roles and specific forms of authority that were recognized and expected rather than exceptional. The lady of the castle managed the domestic economy of the household, a complex operation involving the supervision of large numbers of servants, the management of food production and procurement, the oversight of the sewing and weaving workshops that produced the clothing and furnishings the household needed, and the care of the sick and injured who came to the castle for treatment. She also managed the social life of the court, the hospitality that was a fundamental obligation of the noble household, the reception of guests who might range from wandering knights to royal, messengers to the bishop on his visitation round, the management of the relationships between the household's various members that were constantly generating friction, requiring diplomatic resolution. Medieval household management was not what we might now call domestic in the diminutive sense. It was political, social, economic, and logistical management of a small institution that was simultaneously a military base, an agricultural enterprise, a judicial court, and a diplomatic post. The women who performed this management did so within the ideological framework that defined their role as complementary and subordinate to their husband's authority. They were managing on behalf of their lords, in their lord's absence, according to their lord's interests. Or at least, this was the framing that made the arrangement acceptable to the surrounding society. The reality was often considerably more autonomous. Women who managed estates for years during a husband's absence at the Crusades, and some crusader absences lasted a decade, were making decisions that shaped the long-term character of the estates in ways that had nothing to do with their husbands' preferences, because their husbands had no opportunity to express preferences. Some of these women, given the freedom of their husbands' extended absences, flourished in ways that made the husband's eventual return complicated. The woman who had been running everything competently for 10 years does not always welcome the return of someone who wants to take the reins back. The medieval historical record is not rich in explicit accounts of this dynamic. People were understandably not enthusiastic about committing to righting their resentment of returning husbands, but it is present in enough indirect evidence to suggest it was a genuine social phenomenon. The noble woman who was widowed before her husband's return, or whose husband did not return, became the most powerful version of herself that the medieval system allowed. The dowager countess or baroness, managing her dower lands independently, operating as a feudal lord in her own right, conducting her own legal affairs and her own political relationships, was a figure of real power in the medieval landscape. Some of them chose to remarry and resubmerge that power in a new marriage. Many did not. Chapter 10. Christine de Pizan, the woman who wrote back. You cannot tell the story of medieval women who lived without men without stopping for an extended visit with Christine de Pizan, because Christine is, in many respects, the person who most consciously and most systematically looked at the situation of women in her society and decided to do something about it with a pen. Christine was born in Venice in 1364, the daughter of Thomas de Pizan, a physician and astrologer who was appointed to the French royal court when Christine was a small child. She grew up in the French royal court, was educated beyond what most women of her time received, and married Etienne du Castel, a royal notary, at the age of 15. By all accounts, including Christine's own. The marriage was genuinely happy. They had 3 children. They had 10 years together. Then, in 1390, Etienne died of plague. Christine was 25 years old, with 3 children and an elderly mother to support. In a society that had no institutional provision for her situation, beyond the expectation that she would remarry or enter a convent, she did neither. What she did instead was right. Christine became, in the decade following her husband's death, a professional writer. One of the first women in European history to support herself financially through literary production. She began with lyric poetry, the conventional form of court literature, and she was good enough at it that she attracted the patronage of the French royal family and of major noble houses across Europe, including the English royal court under Henry IV and the Italian courts that were beginning to develop into the great Renaissance patronage systems of the 15th century. But what makes Christine remarkable, what lifts her from the category of talented medieval court poet to the category of genuinely significant figure in the history of ideas, is what she did with the platform that her poetic success gave her. She used it to write back. The Querelle de la Rose, the debate about the Roman de la Rose, the extraordinarily popular 13th century French allegorical poem, was Christine's opening salvo in a literary intellectual argument that she pursued for the rest of her writing life. The Roman de la Rose, particularly its completion by Jean de Meun in the late 13th century, contained passages of striking misogyny, attacks on female nature, female intelligence, female sexual morality, that were accepted in literary culture as essentially conventional, part of the expected landscape of medieval love, literature. Christine did not accept them. She wrote a series of letters, participating in what became a public intellectual debate that drew in some of the most significant literary figures of the French court, arguing that Jean de Meun's misogynistic passages were not merely offensive but intellectually wrong, that the characterizations of women they contained were false as empirical descriptions, that the literary convention of misogyny was doing real damage to real women, and that the men who perpetuated it should be challenged rather than deferred to. This was not, in the intellectual culture of 1400, a safe or conventional position. Christine was arguing against the literary establishment, against figures who had more institutional prestige than she did, against a tradition with centuries of authority behind it. She was also a woman arguing against men about how men depicted women, a position that her opponents used against her, suggesting that she was too emotionally involved to reason clearly. She argued back, point by point, with the methodical patience of someone who had decided that the argument mattered enough to have it properly rather than rhetorically. The Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1405, is Christine's masterpiece and one of the genuinely significant works of medieval European literature. She imagines herself visited by 3 allegorical figures, reason, rectitude, and justice, who instruct her to build a metaphorical city as a refuge for women against the calumnies of misogynist literature. The city is built, brick by brick, from the biographies of famous and virtuous women, historical, mythological, and contemporary, whose lives serve as evidence against the misogynist claim that women are inherently vicious, unstable, and intellectually inferior. The argument Christine is making is essentially empirical. She is pointing to the evidence, to the actual lives of actual women, and saying, look at what women have done, what they have built, what they have governed, what they have created. The claim that women are incapable of virtue, of reason, of authority. Look at the evidence and tell me that claim survives contact with reality. It did not, in Christine's telling, survive contact with reality at all. The City of Ladies is not a perfect feminist text by modern standards. Christine operates within certain assumptions about gender and social hierarchy that are entirely medieval, and her vision of female virtue is not always the one that a modern reader would endorse, but it is a systematic evidence-based argument against misogyny made in 1405 by a woman who had experienced the concrete consequences of misogynistic social arrangements in her own life and had decided to do something intellectual about it. Christine continued writing for 3 decades, producing an extraordinary range of work. More lyric poetry, a biography of Charles V, military, treatises, guides to political governance, moral philosophy, and the Book of Peace, written in the traumatic context of the 100 Years' War and the civil conflict that was destroying France around her. Her final work, The Tale of Joan of Arc, written in 1429, was completed within months of Joan of Arc's military victories, and it is one of the most immediate and most moving responses to Joan's career that we have. Written by a woman who had spent her entire life arguing that women were capable of the very things Joan was demonstrating on the battlefield. Christine spent the last years of her life in a convent, probably Poissy, where her daughter was a nun, having retired from the world of the French court after the political situation in Paris became too dangerous. She was in her 60s. She had been writing professionally for 4 decades. She had supported herself, her children, and her mother through her pen, navigated the most complex and competitive literary environment in Europe, engaged with the most significant intellectual debates of her generation, and produced a body of work that is still read and studied 600 years later. She did all of this without a husband. She did all of this because she had no husband, because the death of Etienne du Castel had pushed her into a situation where she had to find another way, and the way she found was her own mind. Chapter 11. The Mystics, Women Who Found Authority in Ecstasy. The medieval mystic occupies a peculiar position in the history of female independence. She is, in some respects, the most dependent of all women, dependent on the church for her vocation legitimacy, dependent on male confessors and spiritual directors for the institutional validation of her experiences, dependent on the goodwill of a religious establishment that was constitutionally suspicious of female spiritual autonomy. And yet the mystics claim, the claim of direct, unmediated experience of the divine, gave her a form of authority that no institutional structure could fully contain. We have already met Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kempe, 2 of the most significant English mystics, but the broader European female mystical tradition is rich enough to deserve its own extended treatment because it represents one of the most sustained and most extraordinary examples of women creating intellectual and spiritual space for themselves within structures designed to limit them. The Rhineland mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Hedwig of Antwerp, Meister Eckhart's Circle of Women, produced a body of mystical writing in the German and Dutch vernacular languages that is among the most philosophically sophisticated religious literature of the medieval period. These women were not trained theologians in the institutional sense. They had not attended universities, had not studied the scholastic curriculum. What they had was an intense interior religious life, a sophisticated grasp of the theological tradition available to them through reading and preaching and conversation, and an extraordinary ability to articulate in language the specific character of mystical experience. Hedwig of Antwerp, probably a beguine, probably writing in the mid-13th century, though very little is known about her biography, wrote letters, visions, and poems that engage with the theology of love and divine union with a philosophical precision and a literary skill that has led modern scholars to place her among the most significant mystical writers of the medieval period. Her use of the vocabulary of courtly love, min, the Middle Dutch word for love, which resonated with the secular love poetry of the troubadour tradition, to describe the soul's relationship with God, created a specifically vernacular, specifically female theological language that was both accessible and intellectually rigorous. Catherine of Siena, Dominican tertiary, mystic, and eventually doctor of the Church, represents the further end of what female mystical authority could achieve in the right political moment. Catherine Benincasa was born in Siena in 1347, the 24th child of a dyer, and began experiencing religious visions as a child. She became a Dominican tertiary, a lay member of the Dominican order, living a religious life in the world rather than in a convent, and by her 20s had developed a reputation for sanctity, healing, and mystical experience that attracted a community of followers that included men as well as women, priests as well as lay people. What Catherine did with this authority was extraordinary. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, dictated because she herself was apparently not literate until late in her life, to figures across Europe, including Pope Gregory XI, who was at the time residing in Avignon rather than Rome, in the 70-year period known as the Avignon Papacy. Catherine wrote to Gregory with a directness that was, by any measure, startling. She addressed him as Babbo, Daddy, in the affectionate Tuscan usage, while simultaneously telling him that his continued absence from Rome was a scandal, that he needed to return to the Holy See, and that his failure to do so was a failure of his responsibilities as Christ's vicar on earth. She wrote this to the Pope, repeatedly, with the calm insistence of someone who had absolute confidence that she was right and that he needed to hear it. He went back to Rome in 1377. Whether Catherine's letters were the primary cause of Gregory's return, the political situation was complex enough that no single cause can be identified. The fact that a young woman from a dyer's family in Siena was writing to the Pope telling him what to do, and that this was taken seriously rather than dismissed, is an extraordinary demonstration of what the mystical claim to divine authority could achieve, in the right circumstances with the right personality behind it. Catherine was canonized in 1461 and declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970, one of only 4 women to hold that title. Her theological work, particularly the Dialogue, a long conversation with God that she dictated over an extended period, is genuinely significant as theology, not merely as devotional literature. It engages with the nature of divine love, the soul's relationship with God, the structure of sin and redemption, and the specific responsibilities of the church hierarchy with a systematic rigor that the title of Doctor of the Church reflects accurately. The visionary authority that mystics like Catherine deployed was always fragile, dependent on the continued support of church officials who could withdraw their endorsement, dependent on the mystic's continued ability to demonstrate the authenticity of her experiences, dependent on the political context that made female prophecy useful or threatening. The same church that celebrated Catherine of Siena burned Marguerite Porete. The difference was not primarily theological, it was political. Who had powerful protectors, who was saying things that powerful people found useful rather than threatening. But the mystical tradition gave medieval women something that no other available form of authority could provide. A claim that was, by its own logic, beyond institutional control. The mystic who said, "God told me this," was making a claim that the most powerful bishop in the church could not directly refute. He could only argue about whether the experience was genuinely divine or diabolically deceptive. And if the mystic had enough credibility and enough supporters, that argument was not easy to win. It was, in the medieval context, a form of power. Circumscribed, fragile, dependent on performance and endorsement, but real. Chapter 12. Women of the Renaissance. Edge. The late medieval transformation. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the period that sits at the edge of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, the world that medieval women without men had been navigating was beginning to change in ways that were both promising and threatening. The Black Death, which had killed between a third and a half of Europe's population between 1347 and the 1350s, had paradoxical consequences for women's economic position. The catastrophic labor shortage that followed the plague temporarily increased the value of all labor, including female labor. Women moved into trades and occupations that had previously been restricted to men, filling the gaps left by male mortality. Wages increased, economic mobility increased. The rigid guild structures that had limited female participation in organized trades were temporarily loosened by the practical necessity of using whatever labor was available. This window did not stay open long. As the population recovered over the following generations, the guilds reasserted their restrictive practices. The labor surplus returned, and many of the economic gains women had made during the plague period were reversed. The pattern we noted with brewing, female economic activity retreating as an occupation, became more profitable and therefore more attractive to male institutional control. Repeated itself across multiple trades in the post-plague period, but the late medieval period also saw the development of institutions and practices that would provide new forms of female independence going forward. The expansion of literacy, driven by the growth of towns, the development of vernacular literature, and the increasing complexity of the commercial economy that required written records, gave more women access to reading and writing, and with it access to the world of ideas in ways that earlier medieval women had not had. Christine de Pizan could write her arguments because she could write, and the women who could read could receive those arguments and be changed by them. The development of printing, Gutenberg's press dates to the 1440s, putting it at the very edge of our period, was just beginning to transform the landscape of literacy and therefore the landscape of female intellectual access. The books that would circulate in the decades immediately following our period, including Christine de Pizan's works, including the Revelations of Julian of Norwich, including the female mystical literature of the Rhineland tradition, would reach audiences that manuscript culture had never been able to reach, and those audiences would include women. The Italian Renaissance courts that were developing in the 15th century created specific forms of patronage and intellectual engagement that gave some elite women new forms of cultural authority. The learned noble women of the Italian courts, Isotta Nogarola, Laura Serreta, Cassandra Fedele, were engaging with the humanist, intellectual tradition in ways that challenged the assumption of female intellectual inferiority directly on the humanists' own terms, using the classical languages and classical arguments that the humanist movement valued. Isotta Nogarola, born in Verona in 1418 into a noble family that gave its daughters an unusually thorough humanist education, became one of the most significant Latin scholars of the early Renaissance. Her intellectual ambition and her learning attracted both admiration and hostility. An anonymous pamphlet accused her of incest and promiscuity, connecting her intellectual boldness directly to moral corruption in the way that the misogynist tradition had always connected female public ambition to sexual misconduct. Nogarola's response was to withdraw from public intellectual life and continue her scholarship in the privacy of her family home, a voluntary semi-enclosure that echoed the anchorite tradition while operating in an entirely secular context. She continued writing, continued corresponding with the leading humanist scholars of her day, and produced in 1451 a Latin dialogue of the equal or unequal sin of Adam and Eve that engaged with one of the oldest and most consequential misogynist arguments in the Christian tradition, the claim that Eve's sin was greater than Adam's, and that women's inherent moral weakness was therefore established at the foundation of human history. Nogarola's argument that Eve's sin was actually lesser than Adam's because Eve was deceived while Adam sinned with full knowledge of what he was doing is made with humanist scholarly precision and a subversive brilliance that has delighted readers ever since. She was doing what the best arguments in intellectual history always do, taking the opponent's strongest evidence and turning it against them. The women of the late medieval and early Renaissance period were not starting something new. They were continuing something very old, the persistent, creative, often invisible project of women, finding ways to live, to think, and to act with independence in a world that had been designed to limit them. What was changing was the tools available. Literacy more widespread, printing on the horizon, humanist intellectual culture creating new vocabularies for arguing about human dignity and human capacity, the mystical tradition having established that women's spiritual authority was real and couldn't be entirely contained. Chapter 13. The Female Troubadours. Women who sang their own stories. You're in a great hall in Provence. The torches are lit. The evening meal has been cleared away, and the tables pushed back against the walls to create a space in the center of the room that is simultaneously a stage and a court, a performance space governed by the specific social conventions of courtly culture in 12th century southern France. The audience is composed of men and women of the noble class, arranged in a social hierarchy that is visible in the seating and audible in the quality of the conversation. The lord of the hall sits at the center. His lady sits beside him. And at the front of the room, preparing to perform, is a woman. She is a troubadouress, a female troubadour. And what she is about to do, stand in front of this audience and sing, in the first person, about her own experience of love and desire and frustration and longing, is one of the most remarkable acts of female self-expression in the entire medieval period. The troubadour tradition of southern France, Occitania, the land of the Languedoc, was one of the defining cultural achievements of the 12th and 13th centuries. The troubadours were poet-musicians who composed and performed lyric poetry in the Occitan vernacular, developing an extraordinarily sophisticated tradition of love poetry that would influence European literature for centuries, shaping Italian poetry through Dante and Petrarch, influencing the German Minnesingers, contributing to the English lyric tradition, and establishing the vocabulary of romantic love that Western culture has been working with ever since. The tradition was overwhelmingly male. Of the roughly 450 named troubadours whose work survives, approximately 20 were women. The troubadourets, a word that appears to be a feminine form of troubadour coined specifically to describe them. 20 out of 450 is a small number, but those 20 women and the roughly 30 surviving poems that can be attributed to them with reasonable confidence represent something genuinely extraordinary. medieval women speaking in their own voices about their own inner lives, using the most prestigious literary form of their culture, and doing so with a sophistication and an authenticity that scholars have been recognizing more fully with each passing decade. The most famous Trobairitz is the Countess of Dia, referred to in medieval sources as Beatriz de Dia, though her precise identity is debated. She is the only Trobairitz whose melody as well as text survives. We can remarkably hear her music, as she intended it to be heard, across 8 centuries. Her most celebrated poem, A Chantar Mierde, Sokyo no Voria, I Must Sing of What I Would Rather Not, is a masterpiece of the troubadour form, using the conventional vocabulary of courtly love to express something entirely unconventional. A woman's frank acknowledgement of her own desire, her frustration at a lover who has withdrawn his attention, and her direct challenge to him to return. The poem is not conventionally feminine in the passive waiting sense that medieval gender ideology would prefer. The Countess of Dia is not suffering prettily in hoping to be noticed. She is making an argument. She is asserting her own worth, reviewing the evidence of her lover's good treatment by her, and essentially demanding to know what his problem is. The tone is somewhere between wounded pride and controlled fury, and it is entirely authentic in a way that much troubadour poetry, with its elaborate conventions and its performative suffering, is not. Other Trobairitz are equally remarkable. Castelloza, probably from the Auvergne, writing in the early 13th century, wrote 4 poems that survive, all of them dealing with the specific situation of a woman who loves a man who does not adequately return her love, and all of them notable for the directness with which she examines her own emotional situation. She writes about the irrationality of love with a self-awareness that is almost modern. She knows she should not persist in loving someone who treats her badly. She knows it makes her look undignified, and she cannot stop. This is not the idealized suffering of conventional courtly love poetry. This is a person reporting on an actual experience with uncomfortable honesty. Bierris de Romance wrote a poem addressed to another woman, Na Maria. That is one of the most discussed and most debated poems in the Trobairitz corpus because it uses the conventional language of courtly love, the language normally used by a male poet addressing a female beloved, in a poem explicitly addressed by a woman to a woman. Whether this represents a same-sex relationship, a poetic experiment, a coded expression of something else entirely, or something else, is a question that cannot be definitively resolved. What it unambiguously represents is a woman using the forms of her literary culture with a freedom and a creativity that the standard gender assumptions of that culture would not have predicted. The Trobairitz were not marginal figures in the troubadour tradition. They participated in tensons, the debate poems that were one of the major forms of troubadour literature, with male troubadours engaging in poetic arguments on equal terms. The tension between the Countess of Dia and Rimbaud d'Orenga, if it is genuine, which is debated, shows a woman arguing with one of the most celebrated poets of her generation about the ethics of love, giving as well as she gets, and not being obviously outmatched. The cultural conditions that made the Trobairitz possible were specific to Occitania and were not widely replicated elsewhere in medieval Europe. The courts of southern France, particularly under rulers like Ermengarde of Narbonne, whom we met earlier, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, created an environment in which female cultural authority was more genuinely possible than in most other contemporary contexts. The ideology of fin amour, courtly love, while it had its own forms of gender hierarchy, also created a space in which female judgment was theoretically sovereign, in which the lady's assessment of the knight's worthiness was the standard by which the courtly world organized itself. This theoretical sovereignty did not translate into actual political power, but it did create a cultural framework in which women's voices, women's perspectives, and women's literary expression had legitimacy. The Trobairetes used that legitimacy. They took the forms of the dominant literary tradition and filled them with their own experience, their own desires, their own frustrations, their own assessments of the men they loved, and the social conventions they navigated. They wrote, as Castelloza explicitly acknowledges, against the convention that said women should not speak first, should not declare their love openly, should not make themselves vulnerable to rejection by speaking rather than being spoken to. She spoke anyway. They all spoke anyway. And what they said, across 8 centuries and through the accidents of manuscript survival that preserved some of their work and lost most of it, is still worth hearing. The transmission of Trobairetes' poetry tells its own story about medieval women's cultural position. The poems that survive do so in manuscripts compiled primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the flourishing of the tradition. The attribution of poems to specific poets, male or female, was not always careful, and some poems now recognized as feminine-voiced were attributed to male poets in some manuscript traditions. The recovery of the Trobairetes as a significant literary phenomenon is largely a modern scholarly achievement, the result of scholars asking different questions of the existing evidence and finding answers that had been there all along. This pattern, women's cultural production present in the historical record, but systematically overlooked or misattributed until someone decided to look properly, is not unique to the Trobairetes. It is the pattern of medieval women's cultural history in general. The work was done, the voices were raised, the songs were sung, the manuscripts survived. And for several centuries after, the scholars who examined those manuscripts were not, for the most part, looking for women. So they did not find them, or they found them and moved on. We are still, in many areas of medieval studies, in the early stages of looking properly. What we are finding as we look is that the songs were there all along. Chapter 14. The Long Shadow. What medieval women without men built and left behind. Let's take stock of what we have seen. Across the chapters of this video, we have moved through an extraordinarily varied landscape of medieval female life. Through the anchorite's cell and the beguinage courtyard, through the merchant's counting house and the abbess's study, through the castle under siege and the troubadour's performance hall, through the mystic's vision and the healer's herb-scented workroom. We have met women of extraordinary range and variety, queens and peasants, scholars and brewsters, mystics and merchants, poets and politicians. What connects them? What makes them a coherent subject rather than simply a collection of individual exceptional stories is something more fundamental than their gender or their independence, though both of those things are part of it. What connects them is a specific relationship with the available systems of their world. They all, in different ways and to different degrees, found ways to use those systems for purposes the systems had not been designed to accommodate, to locate the spaces within rigid structures where movement was possible, and to build something durable in those spaces. The women who built the most durable things, whose legacies lasted longest, whose achievements are still visible to us today, tended to do so through institutions that gave their work a form that could survive them. The abbesses who built and endowed convents created institutions that lasted centuries after their deaths. The beguines who established beguinages created communities that in some cases survived into the modern era. The mystics, who dictated their visions and found scribes willing to copy them, created texts that survived, sometimes in remarkably narrow escapes, like Julian's Revelations and Marjorie Kempe's book and Marguerite Porret's Mirror, all of which came extraordinarily close to being lost entirely, but that did survive and that continued to be read. Christine de Pisan's City of Ladies is in print in multiple modern languages. Julian of Norwich's All Shall Be Well is quoted in times of crisis by people who have no idea it comes from a 14th century anchoress in a cell in Norwich. The beguinages of Belgium are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Hildegard of Bingen's music is performed and recorded by contemporary musicians who find in it a freshness and a strangeness that 8 centuries have not diminished. Catherine of Siena is a doctor of the church. The legacies are real. The buildings are still standing. The books are still being read. The music is still being sung. But let's be honest about what was lost, as well as what was preserved, because the losses are equally significant and less often acknowledged. The healing knowledge of the female medical tradition, the accumulated empirical wisdom of generations of midwives and herbalists, was largely destroyed in the early modern period by a combination of the Reformation's disruption of the monastic medical tradition, the professionalization of medicine under male guild control, and the witch persecutions that targeted female medical practitioners with specific ferocity. What survived did so in fragmentary and unofficial forms, in the folk medicine traditions that persisted in rural areas outside of institutional reach. The systematic body of knowledge that the medieval female healing tradition represented, the result of centuries of careful empirical observation, was not written down in preservable form, was not institutionally protected, and therefore did not survive the disruptions of the 16th and 17th centuries in any complete sense. The poems of the Trobairettes that did not survive, the majority, by the standards of manuscript survival rates, are gone as completely as if they had never been written. The intellectual production of the beguines, whose works were condemned and burned. Marguerite Porret's case is the most dramatic, but she was not alone. Exists only in the traces left by their condemnation. The legal records of the women who ran businesses, managed estates, conducted their own legal affairs. This material is being recovered piece by piece from archive collections that no one spent 200 years systematically excavating for female subjects, and the recovery is necessarily incomplete. The tradition of female economic independence in the urban trades, the silk women, the Brewsters, the guild craftswomen of the late medieval city, was progressively eroded by the same forces that eroded it in brewing. The professionalization and capitalization of trades under male institutional control, the hardening of guild exclusions against women, and the gradual narrowing of the economic spaces in which women could operate with genuine independence. The female economic participation that was a normal feature of medieval urban life became, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, increasingly exceptional and increasingly contested. The beguine movement itself never fully recovered from the sustained ecclesiastical pressure of the 14th and 15th centuries, and while individual beguinages persisted, the movement never regained the scale and the intellectual vitality of its 13th century peak. What does all of this tell us? It tells us that the gains that medieval women made, the spaces of independence they created, the institutions they built, the intellectual and cultural achievements they produced, were not automatically cumulative. They did not inevitably lead forward to a progressively more equal world. They could be reversed, they could be eroded, they could be forgotten so thoroughly that subsequent generations had no idea they had existed. The assumption that human history moves in a single direction, from worse toward better, from less equal toward more equal, does not survive contact with the actual historical record. The medieval women in this video were, in some respects, more economically active, more legally recognized, more institutionally powerful than women in the early modern period that followed them. The 17th century woman in England had fewer opportunities to participate in organized trade than her 14th century predecessor. The early modern period that succeeded the Middle Ages was, in certain specific respects, worse for women than the period it replaced. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of historical honesty, a reminder that the achievements of any generation are not guaranteed to their successors, that the spaces opened by one period can be closed by the next, that progress is not inevitable and needs to be actively maintained. And it is a reminder of what those medieval women actually built, which was not merely institutions or poems or businesses or theological arguments. What they built, over 3 centuries of persistent, creative, often invisible work, was a demonstration that women without men could govern, could think, could create, could heal, could trade, could argue, could sing, could pray, could fight, could persist. Not that they could do these things if given permission, not that they could do these things under exceptional circumstances, that they could do these things, full stop. The woman in the workshop at the beginning of this video, standing in the quiet after her husband's death, making her decision, she had predecessors, hundreds of years of predecessors, women who had stood in similar moments of choice and had chosen their own path and had mostly managed, women who had built the legal precedents and the social conventions and the institutional structures that made her choice slightly less impossible than it would otherwise have been. She probably didn't know about most of them. History had not, for the most part, been written with her in mind, but they were there in the structures around her, invisible in the way that foundations are invisible, buried, essential, holding everything up. She makes her decision. She opens the workshop. She gets to work. Chapter 15. The Forgotten Majority. Ordinary women who lived extraordinary lives. Or let's talk about the women we almost missed entirely. Not the abbesses, not the mystics, not the countesses managing their castles, and the merchant widows petitioning Parliament, and the Trobarits standing in great halls, singing their own desires back at the audience. Those women are extraordinary, and they deserve every chapter we have given them, but they are, in the most literal sense, exceptional. Women whose stories survived because something about their lives generated enough documentation, enough institutional attention, enough historical consequence to leave a paper trail that subsequent centuries could follow. Behind them, vastly outnumbering them, constituting the actual demographic reality of medieval female life, were the ordinary women, the peasant women, and the minor craftswomen, and the small-town alewives, and the domestic servants, and the women who farmed strips of land in open-field villages, and the women who spun wool for piece rates that barely covered their children's food. Women whose names appear, if they appear anywhere at all, in a single court record or a single tax assessment or a single coroner's inquest. Women who lived entire lives of considerable complexity and occasional independence that the historical record preserves in fragments so small that assembling them into a coherent picture requires the kind of sustained archival patience that only became a serious scholarly project in the late 20th century. This chapter is for them. Because their story, the story of the ordinary medieval woman managing an ordinary medieval life without a man, or with an inadequate one, or with one who was present only intermittently, or with one whose presence was more burden than support, is in many ways the most important story in this video. Not because it is more dramatic than Julian's theology, or Christine's arguments, or Nicola de la Haye's military command. It is not. It is far less dramatic, but it is the foundation on which all of those more dramatic stories rested. And it is the story of how the vast majority of medieval women actually experienced the conditions this video has been examining. Let's start with the village. The medieval English village, the open-field agricultural community that was the basic unit of rural society for most of the medieval period, was organized around the assumption of the peasant household as the productive unit. The household, husband, wife, children, possibly other relatives or servants, farmed its strips of land in the open fields, maintained its cottage and garden, kept its animals, and contributed to the collective labor obligations that the manorial system required. In theory, this was a male-headed household operating under male authority. The husband was the legal head of the household. He was the one who owed the labor services to the Lord. He was the one who appeared in the manorial court records as the household's legal representative. In practice, the household economy was run by both partners, with a division of labor that gave women substantial autonomous responsibility for specific domains of production. The dairy, the production of butter and cheese from the household's cow, was women's work in the medieval period, and it was economically significant work. Butter and cheese were not merely food for the household. They were marketable commodities that the woman of the house sold, or traded in the local market, generating income that was, in practice, if not in law, hers to manage. The poultry yard was similarly women's domain, the chickens and their eggs, the ducks and geese, and similarly, a source of income that passed through the woman's hands. The garden, not the field crops, but the intensive cultivation close to the cottage that produced vegetables, herbs, and fruit, was managed by women and was one of the most productive areas of the medieval peasant economy relative to its size. The knowledge of which plants grew best, how to manage soil fertility, how to preserve the harvest. This was women's agricultural knowledge, transmitted through the same maternal chains of oral instruction that transmitted herbal medicine and brewing practice and all the other domains of female practical expertise. When the husband died, from plague, from accident, from the accumulated wear of agricultural labor, from the warfare that periodically swept through the countryside, the widow who remained was often the de facto, and sometimes the de jure head of the household. The manorial records of medieval England are full of widows, women listed as the holders of their deceased husband's land tenancies, paying the entry fines and the labor services, and the various other obligations that the manorial system required of its tenants. These women were not legal professionals navigating the complexities of common law rights. They were peasant women doing what needed to be done to keep their families fed and their land tenure secure. They appeared in the manorial court because the manorial court was where you appeared when you held land and owed obligations to the Lord. They paid their fines and did their business, and went home and farmed their strips. The historical record preserves them as names in court rolls, and the patient work of scholars who have combed through those court rolls has revealed a picture of substantial female landholdership at the peasant level that conventional assumptions about medieval female legal dependency have consistently underestimated. The poll tax records of 1379 and 1381, taken as part of the fiscal pressure that contributed to the peasants' revolt of 1381, provide a snapshot of English female economic activity at the village and small town level that is extraordinarily revealing. Women are listed as taxpayers in their own right in significant numbers, assessed on the basis of their own occupations and their own apparent economic resources. The occupations listed are varied: spinners, weavers, seamstresses, servants, brewsters, hucksters, the last being the small-scale retailers who sold goods from baskets in markets and streets, one of the most common female economic activities in medieval England. The huckster deserves a moment of attention because she is one of the most completely invisible figures in conventional medieval history and one of the most genuinely important in the actual functioning of the medieval urban economy. The huckster was a woman. The term in medieval usage was almost invariably applied to women who bought goods in small quantities and resold them at retail in streets and markets, typically operating without a fixed shop, moving through the urban landscape with her basket or her tray, serving the customers who could not afford to buy in the larger quantities that established shopkeepers sold. She operated at the very bottom of the commercial economy with minimal capital and minimal profit margin, in a trade that was both economically necessary and socially marginal. She was subject to regulation. Municipal authorities periodically attempted to control huckstering, setting price limits, restricting operating areas, requiring licensing, and to consistent social disapproval that associated her trade with sharp practice and dishonest dealing. She was also providing a genuine economic service, making goods available to the poorest urban consumers at the quantities and prices they could afford, functioning as the last link in a retail chain that connected international trade to the daily lives of the urban poor. The huckster who survived in this trade for years, who managed her capital carefully, knew her customers, developed reliable sources of supply, navigated the regulatory environment with sufficient skill to avoid the fines that could wipe out a week's profit, was exercising real economic competence in genuinely difficult conditions. She is not in the history books. She left no letters, no theological treatises, no petitions to Parliament. She left at most a name in a municipal fine record or a tax assessment. But she was there every market day, in every medieval city of any size, doing the work that kept the bottom of the urban economy functioning. The domestic servant deserves equal attention. Domestic service was one of the largest employers of women in medieval Europe. In some urban contexts, a majority of young unmarried women spent at least some period of their lives in domestic service before marriage. The servant who lived in her employer's household occupied a peculiar position. She was economically dependent, legally subordinate to her employer, working in an intimate domestic environment where the boundaries between employment and exploitation were often unclear and where the power differential made abuse both possible and common. And yet domestic service also provided something that young women in other circumstances might not have: distance from their families of origin, a degree of economic independence in the form of wages, exposure to urban life and its possibilities, and occasionally access to the education and skills that a well-run, wealthy household could provide. The servant in a merchant household might learn to read and keep accounts. The servant in a noble household might acquire social skills and connections that gave her options after her period of service ended. The servant in a clerical or religious household might gain access to books and intellectual life. Conclusion: what they built and what we owe them. Let's go back to the woman we left at the beginning of this video. She is still standing in her dead husband's workshop. The children are still asleep. The meaningful looks from the neighbors are still accumulating outside. The world is still waiting to tell her what she should do next. But now you know something about what the options actually were. She could negotiate a vow of chastity and a life of religious independence, like Marjorie Kemp, trading the marital bed for the freedom to be publicly, inescapably, unstoppably herself. She could enter a beguinage and find a community of women where she could work, pray, and think without surrendering her legal independence or her property to any man. She could continue her husband's trade under the guild's provisions for widows, learn the accounts if she didn't know them already, hire the apprentices, compete in the market, petition Parliament if the trade regulations went against her. She could pick up a pen if she could write, and do what Christine de Pizan did. Turn the experience of loss and the necessity of independence into the raw material of a literary career. She could seek enclosure if her temperament ran that way, and find in the anchorite's cell a freedom that the world outside had never offered. She could become the abbess of a convent and govern an institution, manage estates, correspond with popes, produce theology. She could use her knowledge of plants and bodies to serve the women of her community and build a reputation that outlasted any individual patient. She could, in short, do any number of things that the standard narrative of medieval women's lives, passive, dependent, legally invisible, entirely defined by their relationships to men, has consistently failed to acknowledge as possible. The women in this video were not exceptions. They were representatives of a much larger population of medieval women who found ways to live with independence, authority, creativity, and dignity in a system that was not designed to accommodate those qualities in female form. The exceptional ones, Julian, Christine, Hildegard, Catherine, are exceptional in the degree of their achievement and the accident of documentary survival, not in the fundamental nature of what they were doing. Behind every Julian, there were hundreds of women whose mystical experiences were never written down. Behind every Christine, there were thousands of women who managed their families' affairs with intelligence and competence that no one thought to record. Behind every Nicola de la Haye, there were countless women who held smaller stakes against smaller threats with the same fundamental quality of refusing to collapse when the situation demanded that they stand. The medieval world was not kind to women who stepped outside its prescribed paths. The risks were real: prosecution for heresy, accusations of witchcraft, legal challenges to property rights, the social violence of a community that had decided a woman was operating beyond her proper sphere. The meaningful looks from the neighbors were not always harmless. Sometimes they escalated, but the women stepped outside anyway. They found the legal loopholes and the institutional spaces and the social conventions they could exploit for their own purposes. They built communities when the existing institutions wouldn't have them. They wrote books when the official tradition said women didn't write books. They governed castles and estates and convents and guilds and beguinages. They healed the sick and delivered the babies and brewed the ale and argued the theology and negotiated the trade agreements and organized the defenses and raised the children and buried the dead and got up the next morning and did it again. They were not waiting to be rescued. They were not waiting for a more equitable society to be born before they decided to live their lives fully. They were doing it now, in the only world available to them, with the tools they had. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The woman in the workshop makes her decision. She looks at the tools her husband left behind. She looks at the accounts she has been keeping. Because of course she has been keeping them. She always kept them. Her husband was good at the craft, but she was better at the numbers, and they both knew it. She looks at the apprentice who is going to come in tomorrow morning expecting someone to tell him what to do. she decides she is not going to remarry. Not now, maybe not ever. She is going to open the workshop in the morning. She is going to tell the apprentice what needs doing. She's going to finish the commissions her husband left incomplete, because they are her commissions now, and she intends to honor them. She is, in the most fundamental sense, available in any century, going to be fine, because medieval women, the real ones, the ones the history books forgot to mention, almost always were.